In October 1981, protesters gathered outside Leeds Crown Court. By this point, they'd been coming every other day.
When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Drop the charges! When do we want it? Now!
They were demonstrating for the release of a group of young men.
It's very difficult to be pessimistic when people are shouting and calling for your freedom. But I believed I was going to go to jail and may never come out.
No one denies that the charges are extremely serious. After police discovered a cache of petrol bombs, 12 youths were arrested and charged with conspiracy to cause explosions.
Police found the petrol bombs in 2 milk crates.
It seemed like an open and shut case. The petrol bombs had been made. That wasn't even up for dispute. It was clear who'd made them, and more pressingly, that they were prepared to use them.
Some of the accused were members of an organisation called the United Black Youth League.
You might find it hard to wrap your head around how these young men would have any shot at a defence, but this was the groundbreaking trial of the Bradford 12.
Bradford 12 वो 12 एशियाई नौजवान थे.
When a group of British Asians who felt unprotected by the police took a powerful stance against racism and the prospect of violence.
We began to fight back, organised community self-defence.
Their eventual acquittal, based on the principle of communal self-defence, would make legal history in the UK.
Self-defence is no offence! Free the Black Brothers now! Self-defence is no offence!
This all happened during a turbulent time in British history, a time of fear and pain for immigrants and their children.
I just come out of prison myself, smashing a Pakistani up. I just stabbed him. They got no right to be here.
If we keep on beating them up, they might go away.
We don't even want your walkout speech! You're not fit! You're rubbish! You're scum!
And they use very, very bad word which I cannot put on my tongue. Go out, otherwise we will kill you.
This is also a time when a group of young people took a stand against racism and injustice and demanded the right to dignity.
We're going to stick together, and we're going to go out there, and we're going to show them that we're not scared. Right, they think they can pick on an Asian, right, and get away with it. But now we're going to show them this is not true.
What the Bradford 12 did would go on to affect the lives of generations of non-white Brits to come. Across 2 episodes, we'll be guided by the memories of one of the Bradford 12. Just give me your name and in a sentence, tell me what you do.
Yeah, my name is Tariq Mehmood, and I am a writer and a filmmaker and a teacher.
And you said Tariq. I know some people would say Tariq. And so there's a difference, isn't there, between Tariq Mehmood, which is, I think, the proper pronunciation, and Tariq Mehmood. What do you prefer?
You can call me anything.
No, but what do you prefer?
English language doesn't have the sound there.
Yeah.
You know, so we've just got used to it. So it doesn't really matter. You can call me what you like.
I'm going to go for Tariq because I can say it, so I might as well.
Yeah. And now I'm talking to you, my old accent is coming back as well. It doesn't when I talk to white people.
Do you know what? It's exactly the same with me, particularly when I'm in Huddersfield.
Yeah.
Today, Tariq lives between England and Lebanon, where he teaches creative writing at the American University of Beirut. He was born in Pakistan in the late 1950s to a lower middle class family. When you were in Lahore, what was your perception of England? I know at the time many people thought of it as the motherland because of colonialism.
Well, actually, my perception would be very similar to those of people of the time. It was portrayed as a land where the streets were paved with gold. It was a land of untold wealth. And because we lived in a situation of poverty and very often increasing poverty of our families, it was the solution to all ills, in a sense. So at the time when I'm born, I have nothing, you know. So we're about half an hour at the back of beyond where my village is. But in the very early childhood, migration had started to England. And you would often see people whose relatives, fathers in particular, had gone to Valette or London, as it was often called, that their economic position suddenly shot up And all of a sudden, from having very little in their houses, they had radios and TVs, even though there was no electricity in the place, you know. So it was quite a bizarre stage at the beginning.
I know you moved to England around the age of 9 with your grandparents. How did that initial understanding of what England is compare to this notion of the streets being paved with gold? Tell me about when you arrived.
It was terrifying, absolutely terrifying. I saw people kissing dogs, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I saw blonde-haired people, blue-eyed people, red-haired people, people with pink noses, with snot running down them. I'd grown up in a society where we all had the same colored hair. Though because I'm a Kashmiri by ancestry, we did have blonde-haired and blue-eyed and different and dark-skinned and light-skinned people. But around us, I was just a villager. You know, I didn't know I was Pakistani or I was Punjabi or Potawari. But in Bradford, in the early days, I was overawed by the power of the white man, because I got off at Heathrow Airport and he could ask me a question in my own language. And I thought, my God, is there no limit to their powers? And whether he was white or not, I don't know anymore. You know, it was a long time ago. But I was overawed by the technology. I used to think that when I turned the television on, that there were real people inside the television box when we did get it. And I used to run round the back to see where they were. You know, it was really overwhelming.
Because you'd never seen a TV before?
No, I'd never seen a TV before. So no, I wasn't aware of that.
Tariq arrived in England in the late 60s. He was one of thousands of new migrants planning a new life in Bradford, a city in Yorkshire in the north of England.
Bradford, a city of textile mills, has 12,000 Pakistani immigrants, and nearly all of them work in the mills.
This wasn't an accident. The British economy needed cheap labour after the Second World War. There was a gap in the labour market, so many immigrants, including those from Pakistan, filled that gap.
Pakistanis come to Bradford to do the jobs and live in the houses English people no longer want.
This was Tariq's new home. He lived with his grandparents, who worked in one of these manufacturing mills, and who had to quickly adapt to the demands of their new job. For Tariq and many like him, it could feel like a hostile environment.
They very quickly transformed from people who used to wake up at sunrise, go to bed at sunset, to all of a sudden machines that had to clock in, or the humanity of laughter all of a sudden went out of their lives. They had to clear the debt of the moneylenders like everyone else. So their transformation into a working machine, and you have to see Yorkshire at the time as a place where white workers worked during the days and our workers worked during the nights. To make these machines more productive, they added another shift, if you like. Instead of 8-hour shifts, they now run 24 hours, or give or take. So we did the jobs that white workers would not do. And I've worked in mills and I've seen overlookers. These are managers, if you like, one stage below. Hit workers. I've seen workers cry because there was nowhere for them to go to the toilet, and they had to go and do it outside, hiding behind cars, because the toilets in these mills, which we could use, were often so dirty. They didn't have flush systems working. It was appalling. And sometimes the overlookers were violent as well, and they were almost always, in the early phase, racist, without a shadow of a doubt.
I mean, the experience of Bradford at the time, it sounds extremely grey and extremely bleak. Of course, amongst all that, you're there with your grandparents, you've left the country you've grown up with, and you've left your parents. You must have missed them terribly.
Well, of course, I still do. Years gone by, they both left now. It was very difficult because, this is not an era of social media. This is an era, if you want to talk to your mother, you're not going to. By the time the cassettes turn up, you can possibly hear each other's voice. We're very poor.
You couldn't just make a call to Pakistan?
No, we didn't have phones. If you could make a call, it was boom, a minute job. You would hear each other's voices. There used to be telegrams that people would have to send. And very often, actually, our community postal system was way faster than the British postal system, if you like. People who were going backwards and forwards, everyone took bundles of letters, and everyone who came brought bundles of letters back, and then they got distributed. It was much quicker. So yes, indeed, my early years of yearning were really always trying to find a way to go back to my mother, who it was against my will to come to England. It was against her will for me to come to England. But my grandfather had decided, for whatever is, for the right reasons in his thinking, because they thought economically and they didn't think in terms of the psychological impact either on themselves or their offspring, in children or later. But I was very young, so I never really wanted to come to England.
Tell me about your school experience in those early days.
My school experience was so violent, it still brings tears to my eyes, all these years on. I was being sent to schools way outside Bradford, where they thought that too many non-white children would lower the education. So they bussed us out of the city to where it was overwhelmingly white. And that then created a huge violent backlash for us.
So for anyone that doesn't know, I just want to explain the system of busing referred to this idea that no school within the area should have more than 30% of students from immigrant backgrounds. And therefore, if you were at a school where they'd reached that quota, you would be bussed out to a school much further away, perhaps,
yes,
where that quota hadn't been reached. So you were getting on a bus every morning to go to school?
Every morning, yeah. I have no normal education in Bradford at all. All my education is bused.
Every morning in Bradford, 6 special double-decker buses take about 80 children each from pick-up points across the city to the schools they've been allocated.
It's now 9:20 at this pickup spot on Manningham Lane, and the bus for the children is just arriving.
But it's important for people to understand that the underlying assumption of that was thoroughly racist, insofar that we don't bring the educational standard down just because the color of our skin. In fact, it's uplifted by bringing in the multi-languages we do, the multicultural contributions we did.
Of course, you're a very young child that has been
Yes.
transplanted into a place where there must have been an immense sense of not having control. You didn't have control over how you were getting to school, where you were going to school, the place you lived, any of those things.
In a sense, yes, you're right. We didn't have control. And the schooling system was brutal in the playground. I mean, intensely violent. And always the violence was blamed on us. I mean, I really remember in my junior school in Bradford, I really have any memory where the white kids were the ones who were punished, for the violence on the playground. And let your listeners try to imagine a scene. Because I was very young, because I had just come to this country, I really believed white boys felt no pain. It was usually white boys at school who would attack us, but there were always some girls as well. But in a general rule, it was big white boys. And I didn't believe they felt pain, and I was being beaten up in my junior school. As I was so used to being beaten up and trying to protect my head, I lifted my hand up to stop the blows coming and accidentally hit the white boy on his nose. He bled, and I tell you, I suddenly shot up, and he cried, and I thought, God, he doesn't like pain like me. His blood is red like mine, and I became so violent. I would really have killed him had the teachers not lifted me off. One or two of them came, lifted me off, because all of a sudden I felt that my time had come, that I'd been deceived. And really that led to never accepting that violence. And to this date, never accepting being put down again on falsities and images.
How often were you experiencing violence?
Pretty much daily. It was every time we went onto the playground, but the violence took a very different turn by the time we got to the second school. And here we would be beaten up as we got off the buses. We would be attacked in the playgrounds. There was, on the way back from schools, we would sometimes be ambushed on a bus. You'd get on a bus, there was nobody on the upper deck, and suddenly a big gang of white boys would jump up from behind the seats and beat you up. And we ended up in a situation where it was so uncontrollable at school that we were released half an hour before white kids so that we would clear away.
So the children of immigrants would be released half an hour before so they could get home without facing violence?
Yes, that was in my school, and I'm a witness to that. It's not to say that we were the only ones. My school was somehow unique. It wasn't anything but unique. But when we got into the city centres, it didn't stop. You know, there were gangs in those days who hunted us down, you know, and that continued really for many decades later.
And, you know, you seem to be very clear that there didn't seem at the time to be any accountability. Did you know what the motivation was? Did you know why you were being beaten? Did you understand that?
Yes, it was racism. It's very difficult not to understand because we'd already grown up with I have very vivid memories at the junior school where I was in the center of a group of young kids who ran round me holding hands and singing, "God made little black people. He made them in the night. He made them in a hurry and forgot to paint them white." So these were the racist nursery rhymes. They would rub the skin to see whether it was a different color or whether it was dirt. So these were not uncommon, and they didn't let you forget. And, you know, it's not that every white person was coming to murder us. On the contrary, even our white friends, one of them was in tears because he'd been forced to join the white gang as it attacked us. He didn't want to attack us. He didn't want to fight. He was one of the nicest lads at school, but if he didn't, they beat him up. So the violence was very much focused. It was a racist violence.
What was that doing to your well-being? Because I can imagine, you know, being the child of immigrant parents myself, I think there was perhaps a disconnect between what was going on in my world and what was going on in my parents' world. Not because there's any bad intention, but just because they're transplanted from a different culture. So I want to know, were you getting solace from anywhere? What was that doing to your well-being?
Our well-being, first and foremost, was to go to school and come back alive and unbattered. You know, the question of a dignified well-being comes much later. What you're referring to is that you've already skipped the right to life. You've assumed you have a right to life. We had to fight for the right to life. So we didn't think in terms of, oh, let's go see a shrink or let's go see psychological support or anything like that. We were just very happy. We've gone to school. Now we've got to go home. And when we get home, got to explain to my family that the rips on my coat and the dirt, mud and stuff that's on, it wasn't my fault. And very often when we got home, we were blamed. You know, I was certainly blamed for being a trouble causer when that was, you know, couldn't be further from the case. So the jacket might get ripped. So, of course, we're very poor. You need to buy another school uniform and so on. So everything was all intertwined, but we survived by sharing the commonality of our experiences with other friends who were going like that, by making sure that we went to the younger kids and protected them in their other schools. So kids from each other's schools came. We had no choice but to organize. There's no way to live on your own, go out. You had to say, okay, 10 of us are going down in this direction. And that was really the formative phase of schooling. Now, when you go through a schooling like that, we're not going to come out with much academic achievements.
And it strikes me as well that you didn't have a huge degree of stability even within the home space. And you're not blaming anyone there or pointing fingers.
No.
Essentially, your grandparents are also going through an experience which is very demanding, requires a huge amount of change, is very challenging. I know by the time you're finishing school, around the age of 16, you end up homeless.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, it's a very, very difficult situation without trying to criticize nothing. My uncles who had brought me here had got married. They had their own lives. They had their wives, and it's very difficult to look after somebody else's child as your own, especially in a foreign land. And I was given £10 and a suitcase was packed for me and asked to leave. And that's what happened. And I walked. I wasn't a drug addict. I wasn't stealing. I was doing nothing, actually, and cutting that long story, a very emotionally charged story for me, I walked out and I had nowhere to go and I didn't know what to do. And I think what hurt me the most was my suitcase was packed and I was given £10. If my family were angry with me and said, leave, get out, family often do that. But it wasn't like that. And I thought to myself, oh, I'm really not wanted here.
There was a kind of stoicism around just, here's a suitcase and £10.
And leave.
That first day, where did you go?
First day was, I didn't know where to go, what to do. And I walked into town carrying my little suitcase. And I went into the Central Library. It had a little cafe. I sat in a cafe. I didn't spend any money and didn't know what to do. Didn't have any friends who could put me up. I had no idea.
Did your mother back in Pakistan know what was happening? Did she know you were homeless?
Yes, she knew I was homeless and she almost lost her mind trying to find me. She used to look at hippies going up and down the Grand Trunk Road and see if they knew me. Any hippies from anywhere in the world, she assumed I'd become a hippie.
What? So she thought you might have come back to Pakistan?
No, she thought any white person going by might know where I was.
Oh, really? So she thought she'd just ask anyone?
Yeah, she couldn't find me here for a few years. I knew I was underage, so I was always worried that I might get grabbed and get thrown into the home for underage children. So that was my great big fear. They'd work out what was wrong.
So Tariq tried to stay under the radar, a difficult thing to do when you're homeless and racism is all around you. But the fight back was brewing. His story continues in part 2. Welcome back to Outlook with me, Mubin Azhar. We've been hearing from Tariq Mehmood, the writer and anti-racist campaigner. Born in Pakistan, he came of age in Bradford in the north of England in the 1970s. It's a time of rising unemployment and high inflation. The economic downturn was a gift to the far right, who were quick to blame immigrants for the stalling economy. This festering culture of blame wasn't academic. It had consequences. Racist violence across Britain. A word of warning, there'll be some outdated language in this part of the programme that may offend you.
You must take your listeners to the 1970s. And this is a period of mass violence from the length and breadth of this country. Murders are taking place in Southall, in East London, in the Midlands, in Bradford. People are sleeping in their houses and they would get petrol poured through the letterboxes and they would be lit up. Petrol bombs would be lobbed through people's windows. And at night, gangs of white youth would go on hunting expeditions because they thought it was normal to hunt us down.
Hunt down brown and black people?
Black people. Brown doesn't come in. Brown is a product of the last 10, 15 years. We were all called black. It's very important to understand. They often used words to describe us, but it didn't mean if they meant Pakistani, it meant Pakistanis. To the racist, an Arab was a Pakistani. We were all whatever in this pot.
So at this point, everyone is black.
So have you attacked black people?
Yeah.
What have you done?
Kicked him in. My boot. And a knife.
Only men?
Yeah. Don't kick women sometimes. I'll go out on the face. Because you can, as you're walking down the streets, you can hear him saying in Pakistani language, why should they speak in Pakistan language? Why can't they speak in English? This is England, not Pakistan.
So you've got these attacks,
Yes.
this extreme violence, which is all entirely racially motivated.
Yes, but we must also bring within that the British police are not exempt from this process. They believed there was no such thing as racial violence.
You might find some of this stuff difficult to understand, but for Tariq and many like him back then, it was just reality. Listen to this police officer working in London and speaking to the BBC in 1981. He struggles to grasp the impact of racism.
I don't think that the Asians here have any more problems than most.
Most whites, you mean?
Yeah, it's not a racialist problem.
His colleague acknowledges racist attacks, but is ultimately dismissive.
There is exaggeration. I don't believe that there is a large increase in the number of attacks on racial minorities. We report to Scotland Yard incidents of what the officer at the scene thought was a racial incident.
It would later be revealed in a Home Office inquiry that attacks on Asians between 1979 and 1981 were 10 times higher than the reported figures at the time. Some police believed it was Asian people themselves who were responsible for the racism they experienced.
Asian problems are escalated a great deal simply because of their lack of knowledge of the English language, basically. They're reluctant to communicate with the rest of the community simply because their knowledge of English is grossly inadequate.
And this comment from a senior inspector in London is telling. It's worth noting the use of the words them and us.
There's been an increase of attacks and assaults of all kinds. It's not only on Asians, and the increase affects them as much as us, but they are more aware of it.
Some in law enforcement saw a clear line between white Brits and everyone else. These views were expressed after years of reports of racist violence across Britain, and the violence was sometimes fatal. In 1976, Gurdeep Singh Jagar, an 18-year-old Sikh boy, was stabbed to death in Southall, West London, by a white gang. After his murder, a prominent right-wing politician said, "One down, a million to go." If you're hearing about a racist murder, how did that make you feel about your own safety?
We thought we could be next. We thought anyone could be done. When the gangs came out to hunt, we knew the police would not do anything. In fact, there were case after case. The Work brothers is a very famous case where they arrested the victim of racist violence and not the aggressor. And that was a common experience for us. You know, it wasn't unusual to be at the receiving end of racist gangs and the police. But this is also the time when fascists are marching in our streets. And there might be 100 fascists off the National Front and 1,000 policemen protecting them.
You referenced the National Front, which was the organised face of fascism within Britain. They were on the march. They would have meetings.
Yes. The National Front, they were in lots of marches. They would be in Leicester, they would be in Leeds, they could be in Southall, they could be anywhere. They would certainly march on St. George's Day. Little did they know St. George was Palestinian, but they didn't care. That was their day. They would bring their flags out and calling for repatriation.
We are now telling the politicians of this country today that we cannot and will not absorb any more Asians.
Immigration! No! Repatriation! Yes!
Could you tell me why you're a member of the National Front?
I'll tell you I'm a member of the National Front, and you should know without asking me, and you should be a member too. Because if you're British, there's only one party you can be a member of, because all the others are not for us. They're for the Asians, for anybody except the British people. These are the British people around you, and you will not see one coloured face amongst them, because there never has been, and there never will be, a coloured Englishman.
On St. George's Day in April 1976, a day that celebrates the patron saint of England, the National Front marched through Bradford. Unsurprisingly, the march descended into violence.
What do you think happens at the end of these demonstrations? They would go to the pubs and they would mobilize in the pubs and they would come out yet again to attack us. So we saw the relationship between the police and the far-right organizations as not somebody who was neutral in the middle, but very clearly protecting them.
At the time, police disputed the claim that they were protecting fascists. But British Asians were vulnerable and often left unprotected from racist violence. Shockingly, a day after the murder of Gurdeep Singh Jagar, his blood still lay in a pool on the pavement. When a passerby asked the police who it was, the officer responded with the words, "Just another Asian." Remember, through much of this period, Tariq was still young and homeless. At night, what are you actually doing? Where were you actually sleeping?
Sometimes I slept in Manningham Park. It used to have an open-air bath called Lido baths. And I would crawl through these bushes, and inside there, I'd made a little space in which I could sleep. But it was very frightening at night, so sometimes I would break into a house that was empty and sleep there and then leave in the morning and leave a little note if there was paper, sorry. Slept wherever, derelict buildings and things like that.
During the day, he found a place to get some respite, the Bradford Central Library. When you were spending time at the library, I mean, there's a limited amount of time you can spend flicking through books.
Oh, no, it's not true.
How long were you spending at the library?
I would go to the library at 9 o'clock in the morning when it opened. I would wait outside and leave at 9 o'clock at night when it shut.
Every day?
Every day apart from Sundays, and I think Saturdays it shut early. I made all my friends there. The women who worked in the cafeteria, they were so lovely. You know, if I bought a soup, for example, they knew I had no money. They would keep topping it up every time somebody wasn't watching. If I had a cup of tea, I began to meet students. I did their research for them, whatever subject they wanted. I read from nuclear physics to John Locke, David Hume on the treatise and epistemology of knowledge. I just read and read and read. They had newspapers, so I would read newspapers and magazines, and I found a whole world. I don't think I've just no idea how much I read.
Did you read about politics?
I did indeed. It unlocked a door for me, to be honest. Why was I treated like this? Why am I homeless? Why is my mother not here? Why is Britain rich? I began to understand that my problems were more than skin deep, though the skin color may have been one of the causes, and that also applied to the world around me.
The thing that jumps out to me, though, Tariq, is that's a lot for a 16-year-old mind to comprehend. When you're spending 12 hours a day at the library, you are doing research for other people, you're dealing with your own instability. What effect is all this information having on you at the time?
You know, the Chinese have a phrase, the beans in the pan don't know where the heat is coming from. You know, I don't know. This is an era in which I'm only thinking, will I get food tonight? Who's going to buy me? What am I going to have to do to get a curry? What am I going to have to do and where will I sleep? And, I'm just hovering slowly towards drug abuse as well. You know, it's coming in that setup. So I'm just thinking survival. We're in a survival mode. But it's important to understand also, there was tremendous humanity amongst the people around. I made some lifelong friends who themselves were suffering. So there is a collective trauma of migration. And when there's a lot of you having that trauma, the beans in the pan learn that perhaps we don't know where the heat's coming from, but we'll live a lot longer if we jump out of it, wherever that may lead to. But most importantly, we began to fight back. I wanted a different world. The world I was living in was horrendous. I didn't want to live in it. And I wanted a different world. Now, how do you get a different world? You have to fight for it. You have to campaign for it. You have to do things. But I didn't know what campaigning was. I knew if somebody punched me, they would get a punch back. But that's not the way you can change the world. The world has to be changed by finding other sources of organization.
Am I right in thinking you were a big part in establishing the Asian youth movement?
I was one of the founding members. The Asian youth movement was born so that we could defend ourselves, so that we could expose the attacks on our communities, so that we could also unite with others who were suffering similar to us, African people, Caribbean people. We believed that once we had established the right to live, we must live with dignity.
This was a generation of Asians, some who were born in the UK, wanting to tackle racism head on. They were no longer prepared to accept their torment as inevitable.
Justice! We want justice! We want justice! We want justice!
The first youth movement group to be created was in London, 2 days after Gurdeep Singh Jagar's murder.
Now, the youth movements were a national phenomena. It existed in Southall, in Harrogate, in Coventry, in Birmingham, in a lot of the northern towns, even before us. So I felt very insecure individually, but I felt secure as well with the knowledge I had friends who also felt insecure, and we were determined not to live in the cesspit of insecurity.
The Asian youth movement in Bradford was well organised and had around 200 members, all of whom paid 25 pence to join. It was anti-fascist, anti-racist and anti-imperialist. These kids had a political ideology and they weren't afraid to share it. And in a climate where Asians felt they couldn't rely on the police, who sometimes didn't even acknowledge racist attacks, the movement was also about community self-defence.
Sometimes the media would cover self-defense groups with young men doing press-ups and bodybuilding and stuff like that. We didn't believe self-defense was about macho men fighting other macho men. We believed self-defense was about organization.
I know you organised this system of night watches. Tell me about that.
We had built a telephone tree so that if one of us is being attacked, we would make a phone call, this is happening to me, I'm here. You'd phone the next and run there. So very quickly we could get 10, 15 people to a spot, even without cars. We could get there very, very fast.
And without mobile phones.
With no mobile phones. If we were organized, very often you didn't need to actually fight. They were cowards. The night attackers who came to attack us, they would not fight, they would run away.
Would the night watch happen in shifts? Was it quite regimented?
Well, I have memory of standing on the corner of Manningham Lane and Lum Lane in Bradford. We often stood there at night because they usually used to come through town. We know which routes they would take. If the gangs were coming, pubs would close. So sometimes we'd stand on street corners with, sticks or hockey stick or something hidden in a bush nearby. Sometimes we had confrontation, but very often, as I said, because we were able to come out very quickly and organized and look like we're organized, they went. They didn't attack us.
The Asian youth movement organised counter-marches to the National Front. They campaigned on immigration issues, most famously perhaps in the case of Anwar Ditta, a British-born mom who'd been separated from her kids in Pakistan.
So the Asian youth movement did prolific amounts of work. We were volunteers. We didn't accept any form of funding. We did everything on our own backs. We could mobilize 11 coaches, fill them and take them to London simply from community support.
By now, Tariq, no longer homeless, was moving around the country and investing a lot of time in the Asian youth movement. In 1978, Altab Ali, a young Bangladeshi man, was murdered as he was walking home near Brick Lane in East London. 7,000 people, including Tariq, came to the funeral and marched his coffin to Downing Street. Not long after, the National Front moved its headquarters to Great Eastern Street, just a short walk from where Altab Ali was killed.
I also used to live in East London, and I was intricately involved in the resistance on the streets of Brick Lane. I was also in Southall. We were friends as well. It's really important to understand that the experiences of the North are not just unique to the North.
Young Asians were at last mobilising, but the National Front and the skinhead movement were also organised. The racist attacks and murders continued, and for Tariq, things were about to get a lot worse.
What we'd heard in Bradford was that coachloads of skinheads were coming to Bradford.
The rumours would be a turning point in Tariq's life and a watershed in the challenge to racism in Britain.